Um, I would say it's very difficult to be a cat.
Yeah, somebody has to feed them. Somebody has to make sure that their litter boxes are pristine daily. Their main concern is, shit,
Yeah.
did I take enough naps today? And usually the answer is no. But God bless our little babies, God bless our little feline companions who nobody can see as we record this,
Yeah.
but are clearly here. Oh my goodness. We really do love to record when the sky is a hot mess, like Mercury retrograde in Pisces, because that's on me.
That's when the
That's
fun
on
happens.
me. That's when we're really, really messy.
Hmm.
Uh, Hopefully in a good way.
Hmm.
But yeah, I guess. Do you want to get started? If you weren't here last time, check out, well, it's all gonna be part of the same video, I hope. And so we're gonna be in slightly different outfits, but still talking about the grandfather, daddy of time, how he goes through the signs. And hopefully, if you can think about your own Saturn sign, there's some reflection questions as well. And we're going to see what our capacity is. I'm hoping we can maybe also hit the houses, but Mercury's retrograde, so who knows how long we'll have time to yap. We are recording this um, March 8th, so Mercury is in the microwave in Pisces, which is especially muddy. So we'll see what we can do.
And my face is suddenly so itchy. What is happening?
Oh my God. All right, take a minute to scratch the face.
It's like, it's like it knew. It knew. It was like you're gonna start recording. So right now I'm just gonna like I don't know what just happened. That was so
Oh man.
random. That was so funny. I'm gonna call that interruptions.
Yeah, well, that's Mars
That
in Pisces.
just
Speaking of
uh,
irritations,
yeah. Podcast podcastus interruptus.
which you will soon be able to solve with another medication that have to pay out of pocket for in the United States. So just look forward to that. So today we're talking about Saturn in Libra, and this is where Saturn is exalted. Saturn does super well here because if you think about it, the Libra season, right, is the fall equinox when the light starts to dim. And so we often find that like folks with Saturn here have a really strong sense of justice, of discipline. Um, I'm thinking about like what is balance and equanimity becomes really important for these folks. Uh, and I often talk about these folks. I'm like, where are you more focused on harmony than justice, right? Because sometimes that can also be sort of the Libra catch, where you're sort of focused on everything being balanced and within the system and structure versus like, hey, like, is the system already weighted in an unbalanced way? Um, and how is some fairness and justice something that you cultivate over the long haul? I think that there's a natural patience that this group tends to have, right? Because this is like two, it's about 2 to 3 year subgroup that's going to have all the same Saturn sign as you. One example that I actually have for Saturn in Libra, let me share my screen, is somebody really famous who has highlights both where Saturn can be really powerful, but also how it can sometimes be problematic. And that is Meghan Markle, which of course is taking a minute to load. Is it not going to load? Mercury's in the microwave. Okay. So we should be able to see the whole chart. So this is her. She's a Cancer rising, Leo sun, Libra moon. So she's a night chart. And so on the one hand, she has Saturn exalted. It's a really strong Saturn. But Saturn's also going to be her most difficult planet because she is right at night. So Saturn is more extreme in night charts, whereas Mars is going to be more extreme for day charts. Okay. And so what's really interesting is she has Saturn in the fourth, the place of home, family, lineage, but it rules her seventh house. What we're really talking about is sort of Saturn down here in Libra, ruling the seventh house of Capricorn. And as a lot of us know, Meghan Markle was raised into one of the most eminent families in the world, the British monarchy, right? Due to her marriage, right, to Prince Harry. She was not born into an eminent family, but her marriage made her really eminent, right? Um, what's also just really interesting is that time frame, if you know what was going on, was also incredibly challenging and difficult for her. And like they ended up leaving official duties because the scenario was too toxic for her, and sort of the way misogynoir was used in the press against her was really, really difficult. So you have both the eminence of an exalted Saturn, right? Very on brand for how it shows up in her chart. And you also see the difficulty because it's still a malefic. It's still really challenging. Curious if you have any thoughts, Kat, after I show this example. You are muted.
What did you? Okay, I was gonna say something. What's a malefic? What were we talking about? A malefic? Saturn. Where'd you go?
Yes,
Oh, there
I'm
you go.
right here. Can you hear me? Yeah,
Yeah.
no, sorry, I was taking a bit of water.
No,
Yeah,
you're
so
good.
a malefic is one of the traditional
Yeah.
terms for like the challenging planet. So Saturn,
Yeah, I interrupted myself and I got confused as to what I was gonna say. It's uh, you know, he's challenging, right, sitting in her fourth house, and she marries into this very traditional family, right? And
yeah.
then she comes up against, all of this like opposition within that family, and not only like the family itself, but like the institution of the press that is essentially like in like a part of that family. It's just interesting to see that is there. And then is she a day chart or a night chart?
So she's a night chart. So the way you can see that is the sun is in Leo, it's below the ascendant.
Okay.
So the sun has not risen in the sky yet.
So she would have a harder time with Saturn, correct?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So Saturn is probably her most challenging planet. We would call that the malefic out of sect for fancy terminology. And that says a lot about just challenge in general, right? And so we see both, there was challenge in her childhood around family, which also is very on brand when Saturn is there, but we also see a challenge both, in the family she marries into, which is also sort of that the way that Saturn ties in her fourth and her seventh in the way that it rules Capricorn. And so those domains will tend to be intertwined for her.
What about her public life as opposed to like the fourth house? Does she have anything that kind of plays off of that? Because I know that like at least here, like I feel like a lot of people were for her.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at public life, it's a different story, but we're looking at the midheaven, right? So then we're looking at Aries and her 10th house, and that's ruled by her Mars in Cancer, which also has difficulty. It's seen as an outsider, often will be seen as sort of extremes in different cases. And so there is a sense of like I think what's really interesting is sort of the ways that she kind of got represented sometimes in the press as like being aggressive or making Kate Middleton cry, which is often a like Mars as an extreme and an aggressor can kind of come across. And so some of those more extreme and sort of outsider aspects were part of her public reputation. Whether or not she deserves any of it or whether or not she has any of that personally, I don't know her. But that is where you would see that, right? So if you're looking at something like someone's perception, the 10th house, and wherever the midheaven is, whatever planets are there are going to be really big. And if there's nothing there, then you also look at the 10th house ruler and where it's placed.
Interesting. I was just wondering about that. That was my little like caveat off to the side. But
Yeah, it's a good question.
yeah, I know you used the queen as like an example of like a super traditional like somebody whose chart is like showing something super traditional that's like rooted in that. And I can't remember if that was our moon episode.
It was probably our moon or our sun episode. Yeah, she does have an exalted moon in Taurus, I believe, up in the 10th. Or not in the 10th. She has an exalted moon, I believe. It's been a minute since I've looked at her chart, but yeah, she's got the queen has a lot of symbols of eminence within her chart, which could be its own whole episode around like The ascendant ruler, I think, is exalted. There's a lot of pieces where you combine them together. Like this person is going to have a lot of eminence in their life. And sure enough, right, she is a royal and one of the most public and well-known royals in the world for a very long time. Okay, let's talk about Saturn and Scorpio. These folks are really going to be structured and disciplined and sort of intense around sort of emotions, emotional authenticity, the sort of depth and like, right, Scorpio's a fixed water sign. And so there's sort of a lot of resolution to that. Like, I'm going to maintain and endure something. But there's also kind of often a desire around facing decay and death, right? Scorpio season's the middle of fall. And so we see a lot of like, things around decay and things falling apart that are often a major focus for these Saturn folks. And the thing I often like to talk about them is like, what are you trying? It can be both obsessive, but it can also be about control. So, like, when are you trying to control the impossible, and when are you trying to like go deep and understand sort of the darkness, the difficulty, or like the intense emotionalness of life, right? I think one example for this one is actually, let's pop you open. So this is going to be John Travolta. He's a Cancer rising, Aquarius sun, Virgo moon. So Saturn's not his most difficult planet, to be fair. Typically that would be Mars. But Saturn does highlight some issues, I think, around his life. Saturn in the fifth is going to talk about children. And I think one thing to kind of keep in mind is it also rules the eighth house for him. And the eighth house is often a place where we do see issues around death occur. And so one of his children did pass in the Bahamas at 16 years old. And there's also been some allegations of assault with massage therapists. I don't know that it ever like went to trial or something, or if there was settling out of court, but there was, some fifth house things include both children and sexuality. And so there can sometimes be an area where we need to understand more rigor, we need to learn more discipline, and so that'll be sort of the house where Saturn will show up. But yeah, there's also just some interesting things around him that have come up. And so there's the, like, having to deal with grief and children, right? Dealing with the loss of that and facing deep emotional wounds, I think is a big theme for this chart.
Do you see unrequited love in that anywhere? I just know that I remember one of the stories my family used to tell about him was he was just like head over heels for Olivia Newton-John and like had like his whole heart broken.
I don't know that I would say like unrequited love per se. I mean, maybe more so if it was like a night chart, there'd be more, I would expect more of that. Um, how do I put it? I think Saturn can have restriction around some of the topics, and he was in a really long-term, right, marriage. Unfortunately, I think his wife passed in the last year or so due to cancer. And so I think Saturn often highlights an area where we want structure and commitment and sort of certainty, particularly Saturn in a fixed sign like Scorpio. And so there is a desire for like structure and like deep emotional stability. So the question is, um, John Travolta and like unrequited love and Olivia Newton-John, right? I mean, it's hard to say because like obviously I haven't ever like met him and I haven't looked at the transits for when they were like filming Grease to really get a good sense of that. There's a lot about his chart that is, I would say, like wanting emotional stability in both his sexuality as well as his relationships. He's got this very dreamy, romantic Venus in Pisces, where there's a lot around like union and connection and harmony are sort of her big things there. And then Saturn is like in the fifth, and so that can be sometimes restrictive around sexuality. There are some rumors that perhaps he stays in Scientology due to the fact that he maybe isn't as traditional in that sense as we would like him to believe, and that maybe Scientology has some information on him that he doesn't want out. Um, I particularly find folks that have Saturn ruled seventh houses, whether that's like Capricorn or Aquarius, they do tend to want something that is a more structured, committed, long-term thing. And he definitely had like a long-term successful marriage until unfortunately his wife passed recently. So hard to say. I'd have to look at the synastry between him and Olivia Newton-John to have like a better sense of it. But I haven't actually looked at her chart in a really long time, so I couldn't even tell you off the top of my head.
I was just curious if that reflected in that particular area at all, just because of the kind of where it is and,
Yeah.
kind of how it's hanging out in there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'd want to pull back a couple of layers. I mean, that's the kind of chart of somebody that is if they did have an unrequited love, they'd probably move on to find be in a relationship with somebody rather than hold on to something like for the like and then be alone forever. My 2 cents anyway. Okay. So now we're going to talk about Saturn in Sagittarius. And this is a lot around authority, wisdom, but in the world of like philosophy, beliefs, morality, sort of like how is there like discipline around like things working out? There's, Sagittarius is sort of, I would think, like the very like outward version of one of Jupiter's signs. So there's a lot about like world order, like philosophical order, philosophical meaning, and having that like be something that has really like an enduring testing quality to it. It's giving like kind of wise old religious teacher or wise old religious philosopher who's a little bit crotchety. Um, and so I think for these folks, I often am like, hey, like what morality are you imposing? What are the details that maybe are tripping you up or not, right? Like, do you need to be right all the time? Is everything need to be fitting into that worldview? Is there a place for frivolity, even if it doesn't have meaning? Is there a place for things that don't always have meaning in your life? Can it be fun? Can it be silly? Can it be just something else? I want to pull up Jamie Lee Curtis. Interestingly, she has Saturn conjunct her ascendant, which is kind of crazy. So as you can see, she's just Sagittarius rising, Scorpio sun. Where the heck is her moon? Aries moon. So she's very fiery, a lot of fire. Um, I think it's just really interesting that like uh Saturn kind of shows up for her in a couple of ways. Sometimes Saturn also represents your father, and her dad was just not interested in being part of her life. Uh, and she was actually cut out of the will. And so I think it's interesting from a like Saturn and also ruling her second house of like money and finances. Um, Saturn also, like, because it's in her, like, also a deep philosophical belief that she's been very anti-plastic surgery her whole life. I don't know if she might have had other work done, but she's very much anti that. And so sometimes Saturn highlights like a thing where we're restrictive. And so she has a restrictive, right, philosophy. And in her case, it's also about the first house of body. So there's a intense philosophy that's about herself, right? I also have one other one that I want to talk about because he is particularly messy in a hopefully a fun way for us to discuss. And that is Tim Burton, who I think feels more like a Scorpio stereotype than he does Sagittarius. But he does have Saturn in Sag in the seventh house. And that is why he's a little messy. So he's a night chart, right? So he's Gemini rising. The sun is deep in Virgo underneath the earth. The moon's in Capricorn. And so his Saturn is his most difficult planet. Okay. This man has a tendency to be meeting people at work and having affairs. And that's how he gets into a lot of his relationships. It happened with Helena Barnum Carter, um, is sort of one of the most well-known ones. And his previous partner, who was Lisa Marie, actually auctioned off his shit because he never came back for it. So yeah, a lot of the financial stuff ends up being a little bit messy because of his Saturn, and that we can see in sort of the relationship between Saturn ruling his moon up in Capricorn and his moon ruling Cancer in the second. So just, sometimes Saturn highlights where we might struggle with structure. We might struggle a little bit with that. Um, and if your worldview is a little laissez-faire, maybe about those things, you might have difficulty sort of having that kind of buckle down.
I think the one thing about Sagittarius also is like, even with the sun placement, like I'll kind of forget. They're kind of like inconspicuous. It's weird. Like I'll be like, oh, I can't remember who that person's sign. I can't. What is it? And then they're like, oh, Sagittarius. I'm like, that's why. Okay. They're like mysterious. I don't know in some way to
That's
me.
funny. Yeah, I find that, I mean, I tend to find Sagittarius placements like Sag risings very charismatic. Um, they often can be very easygoing on the surface. But yeah, you start to get into like some of the worldview stuff, some of their philosophy, and like that's where things start to get a little bit more sanctimonious, for instance. Okay. We are chugging along. We're almost done with the Saturn signs. There's like three more. We are getting into Saturn's home sign. So Saturn has two signs traditionally where it's at home. That is Capricorn and Aquarius. And Saturn in Capricorn is a lot about tradition, authority. I often think about it as like how do we do great work within the existing structures? A lot of people talk about it as boss babe, and I don't really think Saturn in Capricorn doesn't shy away from hard work, but it's less about I'm going to dominate the like capitalist world game, and it's much more about like I understand my place in the chain of things and my responsibility in that legacy is really the big thing. Um, if you've seen Prince of Egypt, which I love, I watch every year because hashtag Passover. Um, Moses's brother in the movie Ramses is like, I will not be the weak link, right? There's that really over and over again, he kind of like yells this thing. And it's about being the weak link in the chain that like breaks this long tradition. That is a very Saturn and Capricorn thing, which is like I have this mantle of tradition to maintain and to endure, and like I need to build off of that. And that's the onus. And so it's interesting because the first Saturn in Capricorn I tend to think about is Taylor Swift. Now, you know, you would say that she's like done this thing where she's like, in her own family, right? She sort of has set out and has done this whole musical career, but it's very much a family operation, and has been sort of maintained within the family, which I think is very interesting. But like, yeah, we're not 100% certain that this is her birth time. I am more and more convinced as we see more and more events that she is a Capricorn rising of some kind, which would put she's a massive Capricorn stellium, and that includes Uranus, Mercury, Neptune, Saturn, all there. I personally think that she also has a pretty solid relationship with Saturn, but that can be a whole other discussion. Um, and a lot of her work is in some ways like building off of a traditional world building and storytelling, right? Like, um, there's a lot around like what does it mean to be picked and chosen? What does it mean to be like a girl and sort of playing into, I think, a lot of white femininity? Like, I don't think a lot of her, I mean, do I think she's a great songwriter? Absolutely. Do I think that she is turning a lot of these stories on their head? Not necessarily. And that's a very Saturn and Capricorn way of working. Whether you think about Love Story, or even Life of a Showgirl, there's a lot of very unfortunate, very traditional kind of dog whistling in that. Not all Saturn and Capricorn is conservative with a capital C. I just want to put that on focus, but it does play with and understand and work with its lineage. It works like kind of within systems versus being outside of systems. I don't know, Kat, if you have any strong feelings about either this chart or what I've said so far.
I guess it makes sense. I mean, she's really benefited from the systems that are in place, to a degree. I mean, she can play her music, she sings her music, obviously, right, etc. But, like it's not really wavered from that typical like traditional method of like getting into the industry and like the the way like she kind of made that transition, getting into one thing, but then getting transitioned over to like the mainstream pop music from, starting off in country and stuff like that, which also has like really traditional roots like that, it
Yeah.
really, yeah, it tracks to me. So it's actually really strong example, I think, of that from my understanding of, what you've been talking about anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's lots of people that have done really good work on like exploring her looking at white femininity, and I think that is a huge piece of it. Um, I think a lot of her work is still really enjoyable, but like if we don't reckon with that, it's hard not to see it. A very, I'd say similar but also different example is I want to talk about Sean Connery, who also has Saturn in Capricorn and has it tightly conjunct his ascendant. Um, so this is his chart. So once again, we see a day chart. We have a much better time chart for him. He is a Capricorn rising with the sun in Virgo and the moon in Virgo. And yeah, look at that Capricorn Saturn, a degree off the ascendant. Now, I think the first thing I want to kind of bring up is this is a man who, in some ways, is well known for embodying a very traditional style of masculinity. I mean, he was his big break, or one of his most well-known roles, maybe the better way to put it, is as 007, as James Bond, which embodies an idea of traditional masculinity, right?
That was one of the
Um,
first things I thought of when you said, I was like, wow, like the guy known for his traditional masculinity, you mean? Like,
yeah,
absolutely.
I think it's also interesting because like he doesn't really get his breakthrough until his Saturn return, right? It takes him until about 30 to get there. And we also and that's another thing that we see with Saturn is Saturn gets better with age and sort of ongoing time, which I find fascinating. Um, he also had financial struggles as a youth, which would make sense with like Saturn ruling the second house. Like it's something that he gets over, but it does highlight maybe challenges or difficulty, right? Because Aquarius is also a Saturn sign. I also think it's funny because he has a tattoo. He had a tattoo of Scotland on his body, and so there's this very traditional kind of home lineage thing that he has done in a very first house way, which is like I'm going to have it remembered or engraved on me. Um, and so that's like another way that we really see that sort of Saturn aspect of like honoring your lineage in a very physical way. I mean, one of the big things with the Saturn and Capricorn generation, particularly the like 88 to 90 crowd, which I'm part of, is right. It's that it's also co-present with Uranus and Neptune. And so we see as well for like the larger millennial cohort, which many have Uranus and Neptune co-present in Capricorn, is that there is this sort of innovation and also there can be either an innovation both on reclaiming tradition in a way that's very progressive or trying to reclaim and understand tradition in a way that is maybe myopic or nostalgic. And so I think you see both, um, people that are interested in traditional wisdom or traditional languages, or things around like farming and the earth that maybe hasn't been done in a while and trying to reclaim that. But also you get the trad wife and that sort of like traditional nostalgia for something that is um, kind of a role play fantasy and reimagining of what the 50s were actually like versus actually embodying the past. And so I think for a lot of folks, particularly of that like 88 to 90 generation, you know, it is a bit of a differently flavored Saturn, both, yeah, of being able to understand tradition and being part of systems, but also whether intentionally or not, our lives and our signatures both have a way of innovating around it, but also maybe dissolving it. And I think that's the millennial experience, part of what makes the millennial experience so powerful, but also like pretty difficult, not to sugarcoat it. Because these things that we often want to maintain, uh, particularly with Neptune involved, have a way of dissolving around you. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what are we building instead? Before we leave Saturn and Capricorn, I do want to give these folks a little bit of a question to think about, which is like, yeah, like when is, you're doing a marathon, not a sprint when it comes to Saturn. And it's also like, when do you allow yourself to let things go, right? When is it that it's a structural problem? Like, when is the tradition a problem, right? When is it okay to innovate? When is it okay to let go? And, sometimes, and I think this is something that I struggle with a lot, which is like sometimes no is the answer. Sometimes releasing a thing is the answer for moving forward and having sustainability. Um, Saturn can be particularly brutal and having things fall apart if it's not going to work in the long run because Saturn cares about longevity. It's not about forcing a thing to work. That or you have to pay an incredibly high price in order to make it work. And so I think that's just like something to keep in mind, which is like you don't always have to, the entire mantle is not always on you, right? And things can evolve and change. And that doesn't mean that you are breaking the chain of continuity. In fact, sometimes that evolution is how the chain survives. The example I usually talk about is actually Judaism, and part of why Judaism survived the fall of the Second Temple was that the religion evolved to have a practice beyond sacrifice. It was forced to, but if it had just stayed in a place of like grief and staying around sacrifice, that religion would not exist today. And so I'm not saying that like you need to do all of that, right? You don't need to like hold on to a philosophy, but I'm just saying that like sometimes evolution is part of keeping things going. Some deep philosophical things for a Sunday in March.
Dare we say, evolution is part of tradition.
Oh, so is.
Yeah.
And I think if there's anybody there, the Saturn sign that tends to be really good at evolution and moving things forward is Saturn in Aquarius. Saturn, in some ways, prefers this sign, and it's got, in some ways, a bit more strength than Saturn in Capricorn. Because not only is Saturn at home in Aquarius, it also is what we call triplicity or sort of community support here. Now, what's interesting is that this is a Saturn that deals more with being an outsider. It struggles more with like what is going on in authority, but they're very innovative and they're often very like dispassionate philosophical types. The thing I like to remind these folks is, sometimes emotion is important and you need to lean into that. And also, just because you are really good at maybe not taking up space does not mean that you shouldn't take up space sometimes with your wisdom and your thinking. Like just because you see what's going on out in the world doesn't mean you should always hide it. There are two very different people that I have for Saturn and Aquarius. Um, and I got to start with Nicolas Cage because he does have Saturn in Aquarius. And you know, he's such a weirdo. Um, I particularly love watching bad movies. I have actually a whole event that I put on, which is called Bad Movie Night. And we at one point did a movie marathon called The Cage Match, where we had a pretentious Nicolas Cage movie, a cult Nicolas Cage movie, and then a bad Nicolas Cage movie. And he's a strange dude. He's a strange dude.
That sounds like so much fun, though. Also, one of my favorite episodes of Community.
Oh my God. Yeah. Is Nicolas Cage a good actor? Yeah, it's a great episode. Um, so he's a Sagittarius rising, Capricorn sun, Libra moon. And yeah, he has like a Venus Saturn conjunction down in Aquarius. Now, whenever I think about Nicolas Cage, I think about his like communication style, which is very third housey, and how he plays a lot of these kind of weird outsider characters. If you don't know, Nicolas Cage calls his acting style nouveau shamanic. Yeah. And he has like just like a kind of interesting the way that he talks, I feel like is a little bit funny. Just very like interesting and odd. He's also a Coppola, which I think is very interesting. And he literally changed his name to like not be seen as like a Coppola, which is also kind of like a way of like trying to be an outsider, whether or not he should have been. Like I'm like, bro, he still got his first acting gig in a Francis Ford Coppola movie, I believe. So it's not like he didn't still have a little bit of Nepo help. So I thought that was really fascinating. Also, Saturn is a challenging planet for him. He has gone through some financial issues because of his spending. And I think it's interesting that Saturn rules his second house of money. And so he had to spend, he did a lot of very bad movies for a while just to kind of keep the income coming in. The next one is very different, but also Saturn in Aquarius. And this is Yoko Ono. Let me pull up her chart. So she's a Libra rising, also night chart, but she has the sun in Aquarius with Venus and Saturn in Aquarius. It's funny that I'm like looking, I'm like, oh, there's her moon. Her moon is in Sagittarius. Um, right. And so I know that a lot of people know her, right? She is known for her relationship with John Lennon, but she's actually like a really experimental artist. And art and creativity is a massive piece of her life and her work. I think it's also interesting that like she, one of her major art pieces with him was like the sort of this the bed protest, the sort of kind of sexuality tied in art piece where we get the song "Give Peace a Chance" and that recording feels a little fifth housey to me, but she has this very sort of outsider character in the way all of these things sort of came about, and sort of doing a particular style of art that is very kind of conceptual. It's very sort of out there and innovative, and is a huge piece of like what she explores and thinks about in the world.
Why is it that Saturn has two in a row, whereas the other ones, even in traditional, seem to be spaced? Like, do you know offhand, or is that like just
We don't have a full rationale for how the domicile schema was set up. There are thinkings around it. And so one of them is what's called the Thema Mundi, which is a conceptual birth of the universe chart. And in that chart, it's a Cancer ascendant. The moon is in Cancer, the sun is in Leo, and then Mercury is in Virgo. I think I'd have to look at it all again, but basically, it's a really beautiful conceptual chart because it gets both how far Mercury and Venus can be from the sun at any given point in sort of their synodic cycle. It has planets in their domiciles, I think their preferred domiciles. But also, the thing to understand is that Saturn kind of opposes the luminaries. So, like, the way the schema works is that, like, different planets are paired in that wherever one is at home, the other is not, wherever one and vice versa. It's not the same with exaltation, but like let's just talk through it. So like wherever Mercury is at home, Jupiter is not at home and vice versa. So Mercury is at home in Virgo, Jupiter is in exile or fall in Virgo. Jupiter is at home in Pisces, Mercury is in exile in Pisces. And the same with Gemini and Sagittarius. Now, Mars and Venus also do this. So Taurus opposes Scorpio. Taurus is Venus's home. Mars is in exile, detriment there. And in Scorpio, Mars is at home and Venus is in detriment there, and vice versa. You can do the same thing with Aries and Libra. The thing that's interesting is that Saturn basically opposes the luminaries. So the luminaries only each get one, right? The moon only has Cancer, the sun only has Leo. Saturn gets the two domiciles opposing them. And wherever the right, so the sun is at home in Leo, the sun is in detriment in Aquarius. Cancer is at home, or the moon is at home in Cancer and is in detriment in Capricorn. And Saturn is in detriment in both Cancer and Leo. Now, it's hard to say if the Thema Mundi was imagined after somebody already had this scheme up or if they made that the Thema Mundi and then it was sort of imposed on it. But it's a pretty holistic scheme. Um, and so, yeah, Saturn happens to have two signs next to each other. And then it's like not, it's basically at home for like about 6 years. And then it spends, the next 24, 22 to 24 years, right? Um, Traveling the rest of the zodiac.
That's interesting. That's really cool. Yeah. I
Yeah, yeah.
so
There's a lot we're trying to still kind of piece together. And I think there's lots of texts that are still in the midst of being translated and understood. Like I think, you know, when you're dealing with a tradition, lots of things we don't have the full text of a lot of things that, are either resource cited by other texts that we do have and things like that. And so there's some of it which is like some of this just works and we have some of the rationale, but why or how we got there, we don't always have that, which is a little bit frustrating.
yeah, paper degrades. So it stinks. But essentially
Yeah.
what you're saying is that because the houses oppose the houses where the luminaries call home, that's why Saturn is right next is yeah, is basically ruling those two right next to each other, kind of.
Yeah. So basically, and also like this is very much a northern hemisphere system, right? The sort of longest seasons of light, right, starts the summer solstice, starts Cancer season. And the hottest season tends to be Leo season. Saturn is understood as being cold and dim. And so it gets Capricorn season when the light is some of the darkest, and the coldest season, Aquarius season. So, like, there's also just sort of likeness that is tended to be matching these planets.
That's fascinating. I would love to go into more depth on that in the future, though. That would be really cool.
Yeah. Well, we will definitely it'll be a lot of like this is how we got here. I mean, and there's a reason I love it because it the and like why I get a little bit like my eyes tweak when people want to talk about like modern rulership. And I'm not saying that planets don't have affinity for different signs. It's just when you have like such a beautiful schema and the way the traditional schema has worked out, it's like really hard. I don't want to give it up. And that's my own personal bias. All right. I'm not here. Like, if your personal practice is like Uranus rules Aquarius and Pluto rules Scorpio, like, go for it. I'm not here to stop you. It doesn't work really well in the tradition and the techniques that I use. So, but we are at the end of the zodiac and we are finally at Saturn in Pisces. Um, if you remember, March 2023 until like a couple weeks ago, we've had mostly Saturn in Pisces. It's very emotional. It's very waterlogged, right? And there's a lot around what are our boundaries around connection? What is the limitations around healing? A lot of things around structures of water, right? I think a lot about like how you can't hold water in your hand, but you can in a cup, right? There's an ocean floor. And a lot of what I talked about with clients during this period is like, if you have Saturn in Pisces, which is how do you see boundaries as a way of helping you connect more deeply, right? What helps you be sustainably emotionally present? And, there are two people that I think are really good examples of some of both the strength and the challenge of that. We're going to start with Charlie Sheen. So he's a Gemini rising, Virgo sun, Sagittarius moon. And he has Saturn up in the 10th house. It's not conjunct his midheaven, but it also rules his midheaven, which is very interesting, his midheaven in Aquarius. And so you would think his public life would be one of the most difficult places in his life, just because he's a night chart. And you wouldn't necessarily assume that he would have been a very popular, well-paid actor. But, instead he does have things, unfortunately, around like his public life tends to be his own unraveling. right? As in his later life, right? We see the issues with drug addiction. We're seeing some like health issues. The way that he sort of self-imploded, the way that he was moving was not sustainable. So I think that's where you sort of see that come up, which is um, once again, Saturn will highlight the things that if you don't work on it, it will affect you. So that's just something to say. I don't know if that made any sense. Mercury's in Pisces, man.
It did. It made a lot of sense. Also, my brain was just like Saturn, the great highlighter in the sky.
He shows up. He shows up.
It will definitely rock your world if you're not knocking the structures down and taking care of those towers, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The next one I want to talk about is Jane Fonda, who has, in some ways, a much more positive relationship with Saturn. She's a Capricorn rising. She's a day chart, right? She has the sun in Sagittarius, the moon in Leo, and Saturn in the third house. Uh, I think it's really interesting that a lot of her expression of Saturn is very much right activism, whether it's expressing her beliefs and her values. And she really kind of brings both that Saturn and Pisces, like focuses on larger community, larger efforts. Like, if you don't know, she was a massive activist in the 60s and 70s. Like, she protested Vietnam. Some people had a lot of issues with how she protested Vietnam. She was also really, when Alcatraz closed, she was one of many celebrities working to make Alcatraz Island actually into a place for indigenous folks. There was a huge amount of indigenous activism around that. She just, she has a long activist history. And so there is this sort of larger Piscean focus that she brings. It's interesting too because she gets into acting through a friend of her father's. Her father, I didn't really want to be her as an actor, but she basically meets the head of the actor studio in New York, I think, through her dad, and then starts taking classes there. And so you see sort of the third house around sort of education showing up for her as being a major driver around her career. She also, just to kind of be clear, like the Saturn and the endurance piece, she still does protests today. She's still an active speaking out about her views and political beliefs, whether that's about the climate crisis or the ongoing unrest in the United States. Like, she doesn't shy away from these things, and that shows you the longevity and the stamina of a well-placed Saturn.
That's crazy because the first thing I think of when I think of Jane Fonda is like her pushing back against the war machine, sort of against that traditionally. Because I know, like you said, people hated her. My aunt told me like people hated her, and she, but after explaining it, it makes more sense, right? And it's also especially being in Pisces, right?
Yeah, I think Saturn in Pisces has a much more compassionate view and is going to be much more expansive, in a way that like Saturn in Capricorn and Aquarius is going to be a little bit colder. It's going to be much more. Saturn Aquarius is still a visionary. It's still going to be pushing back against things, but it's more of in the head. And Saturn in Pisces is very much a heart-driven piece. And that emotionalness can either be something that it can implode you, right? Like we see with Charlie Sheen, and his emotionalness makes his becomes a problem for his public perception, right? And the way that he interviews when he's like on all of these substances. Whereas that emotional groundedness for Fonda becomes a huge piece in sort of her communication and sort of her ability to be on, I would argue, in many ways, not everything, but on the right side of history. Um,
Yeah, I just saw an Instagram reel she made like maybe 2 weeks ago. She's still like out there going like, you know me, like, let's go. So
yeah, it's impressive. And I think honestly, she has a lot more courage than I think most people in Hollywood do. And I think for that, when the rubber hits the road, that's when you really see people's values, is how uncomfortable are you going to be willing to do to stand up for your own values? That is Saturn through the signs. If you are curious and want to see more about maybe Saturn in the houses, drop us a comment, shout house in a comment, and we will maybe do a follow-up with examples of Saturn in the houses. I know we did a little bit of talking about them with some of the celebrity examples, but if you take nothing else away from this, Saturn deeply cares about what is sustainable. And depending on the zodiac sign it is like what landscape is it going to do that in, right? Are we going to do that through the landscape of the really practical and the embodied, like Taurus? Are we going to do something that's really esoteric or maybe philosophical and in the mind, like Aquarius? Or is it going to be something that is deeply, emotional and feeling and intense, like Scorpio? There's no right or wrong way, but it's really about understanding that Saturn cares ultimately about what's going to endure. And so, how Saturn shows up in your life and what house or sign it's going to show up in is going to say a lot about how you practice and or how that endurance or time works for you. And as always, consider getting a reading, whether it's with me or another astrologer, if you want to get to better understand your Saturn placement and how to better work with it, because he is not an easy dude. He is a little bit by the Captain Von Trapp, um, without the sexy singing, and it can take time to get there. And so, if you are having your Saturn return, my Saturn and Aries kids, good luck. You can do this. So many of us have gotten through Saturn return. You can do it as well. And yeah, stay tuned for next time where we're gonna do more astrology of some kind.
All the good stuff coming at you next time on Growing with the Stars. Cha, cha, cha.
When Mercury will be direct.
Yes. Okay. Bye.